Welcome to the Psych Central Show, where each episode presents an in-depth look at issues from the field of psychology and mental health, with host Gabe Howard and co-host Vincent M. Wales.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to this episode of the Psych Central Show podcast. My name is Gabe Howard, and with me, as always, is Vincent M. Wales. And today, we have a fellow podcaster on our show. The Trauma Therapist Project, it also includes a books, podcast, and it's being listened to in more than 160 countries around the world. There's also an online membership community, and it's all run by a gentleman named Guy McPherson, a PhD and a husband and a father of two. And your doctorate, I believe, is in clinical psychology. Is that correct?
Yes, that's right.
And you have spent the last several years studying trauma and early psychosis and the impact that all of this has on individuals.
That's right. Yep.
Well, that is really awesome. Thank you so much for agreeing to be on our show. We're honored to have you here.
Oh, guys, thank you so much for having me. It's an honor to be on here. I'm excited to talk to you and share what's going on around here.
Great. Well, thank you. One of the things that Gabe just mentioned is that you studied early psychosis. That particularly interests me. Tell us a little bit about early psychosis. How early are we talking?
Well, for the last year, I've been working on the Trauma Therapist Project full time. Prior to that, I was working up here in Northern California at a clinic for 5 years, and we were assessing and treating young individuals between the ages of 12 and 24 who were showing early signs of psychosis. If you think of psychosis, which is a group of symptoms on a continuum, and on the left side, you have early symptoms. And all the way on the right, you might have, let's say, schizophrenia. So on the left side, the early symptoms include maybe hearing strange sounds. People might hear strange sounds that they realize are not their own. They're not coming from themselves. They might see certain things that they realize are odd. They have a certain awareness of these symptoms. In other words, they don't completely believe these symptoms are real. They might begin isolating if they're in school. They might be showing signs or having certain symptoms such as depression or anxiety. They might be having certain somatic sensations, feeling certain bodily sensations. Again, they know they're not real. They're just strange to them. So these are the early symptoms. When people start seeing something, when they have certain kind of fixed delusions or hallucinations, or more fixed, that's when they start moving over to the midway part of that continuum, and things can start to move into full psychosis, or even, again, on the farther end of the continuum, schizophrenia. So these early signs and symptoms can be precursors to something more serious, but we were working to assess and to treat those.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. Now, I guess the question I have next is there a connection between early psychosis and trauma? Can trauma trigger early psychosis, for example?
Yeah, there is a connection. There's a correlation, not necessarily causation. And this was kind of one of my interests. Let me share a story, if I may, to answer this question. Part of the job that we were doing was to take these referral calls every day. So maybe it was my day, and I would be taking these calls from therapists or teachers or parents, all of whom were concerned about a kid. And most often, again, these kids were in school. And so we'd go down this list of questions that we had. Are they using drugs? Have they had any negative experiences? Are they isolating? Have they been bullied, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And 99.9% of the time, I don't even think I can recall a time where there wasn't trauma involved with these kids. And a lot of times it was bullying or witness to domestic violence or, emotional or sexual abuse. There's a huge correlation between experiencing trauma and these symptoms, which doesn't mean that everyone who experiences trauma is going to develop schizophrenia or experience psychosis. Just probably more than 50% of individuals who've had it experience some type of symptoms. One of the important things to do when you're assessing these symptoms is to understand, when these symptoms occurred relative to when the trauma occurred, right? So if the trauma happened after these symptoms, it's obviously pretty much an indication that there was something else that precipitated or caused early psychosis symptoms.
And one of the ways that you looked at all of that was by interviewing lots and lots of people. Tell us about that. Tell us about your process of finding all of this, because you didn't just eyeball it and declare that this is what's happening. You did a lot of research and
we were part of a research project, but I wouldn't necessarily call myself a researcher. At that position, I was working under a licensed therapist. I was definitely a therapist and someone who was doing assessments and really loved working with these kids and sitting down. You said, part of it was asking a lot of questions. The assessment that we did oftentimes took 3-4 hours. Oftentimes we had to bring these kids back because it was so exhausting. It was a lot of questions, and it was an incredible learning opportunity for me to understand and to learn how to do the assessment. When you're working with a kid, it's really hard to get information to flow, and it's certainly not going to work when you're sitting there with a clipboard enumerating this list of questions, which basically I tried to do when I was first starting out. I had this I was fresh out of my graduate program, and I had my clinical hat on, and I was going to prove to my colleagues that I knew what I was talking about, and it was ridiculous. It was a really kind of a steep learning curve for me to understand and to learn how to form these therapeutic relationships and alliances. And a lot of it had to do with understanding, bringing the parents in and watching and just kind of interrupting the pattern, just stopping and saying, I understand you guys have been to a lot of therapists prior to coming here. What were they not getting? What are your parents not getting? What are your teachers not understanding? So in other words, to kind of flip the script and just engage on a very humane level.
Is all of your early work and your early work with both trauma and early psychosis, is that what led you to start the Trauma Therapist podcast?
Yeah, in part. That's a really good question. I was doing a lot of commuting when I was working at that position in there for 5 years. And during this, I would be wondering about my clients as I was commuting, thinking that I don't know what I'm doing. Why aren't they listening to me? I'm no good at this. I should quit and start flipping hamburgers somewhere. And at the same time, I was listening to a lot of podcasts, kind of entrepreneurs, just people from all walks of life who were doing kind of amazing things with their life. It really inspired me. And at the same time, also at work, when I was doing these referrals, just hearing call after call with trauma happening to these kids. And I'm like, what the heck is going on? So as I was commuting and listening to these podcasts and thinking about my own clients, I was thinking, wouldn't it be awesome if I had a kind of master or seasoned therapist right there beside me who could mentor me? And I kind of put 2 and 2 together, and I thought, well, what if I started my own podcast? What if I started interviewing people? And that's how it started. At that time, I was in a clinical group, supervisory group with a kind of well-known trauma therapist named Janina Fisher, kind of internationally recognized. And she was like one of my first interviewees, my first guests. And that kind of really helped me start getting, bigger name guests, which helps me get a lot more people.
Yeah, Gabe and I have been doing this show for close to 2.5 years, I guess, at this point. And we've had an awful lot of interesting people, and I know that we've learned a lot from them. What have you learned after interviewing however many hundreds of people you've had?
It's interesting because when I got to graduate school, I knew I wanted to focus on trauma. And I went to graduate school. I got there pretty, quote unquote, late. I was like about 35, had a bunch of jobs, had kind of been around the block in a sense, and wanted to, when I got there, I was just so consumed with taking in information. What book do I need to read? What workshop do I need to attend that's going to make me the best trauma therapist I could be? And it was all focused on bringing this external information in. What I didn't realize as much as I should have was the value in who I was and my experience and what I brought to the work and the therapeutic relationship. And it's not as if I didn't understand it, but I just didn't get it as much. I didn't value the importance of it. And so what happened was when I started doing these interviews, one of the questions I asked was, can you share like an early clinical error or a mistake that you made? What started to happen and continued to happen is that the majority of the errors that my guests shared wasn't around some intervention that they didn't get right or page 222 of certain manual that they didn't utilize correctly, but it was more centered around themselves not being authentic or not being vulnerable enough and how that ruptured the therapeutic relationship. I mean, and this went on and on and on. And it really brought to my light the importance of the therapist, just being yourself. And that is not always easy. And we can get into that if you want, but that was continues to be the major lesson for me. And one of the things that really inspires me in this work.
Very interesting.
I would like to get into that. I mean, how does it feel for you? I mean, how have you changed because of this? Please talk about it.
What happened was 2 years ago when I was still in that position and I was still doing the podcast, my mother died unexpectedly. So I was at work. I got the crazy call that my mama died, and I was just like floored. And I took some time off from work, and then I went back. And when I was back at work, I remember I was sitting with a client, and this client, completely unbeknownst to why I was out, that client started sharing their own personal story about one of their family members who died. And it was bringing up a lot of emotion for this particular client. And I remember I was just flooded at that point in a way that I had never been before. And I said to myself, this is crazy. I need to take more time off. And so I did. I took about a week or so off, came back to work. And at that point, or during that point, something switched for me. And it was, I talked before about that clinical hat, and I kind of had held on to that. I'd gone to school and I got this degree. I felt I needed to be a certain type of therapist, and I needed to show and prove something to myself, certainly, and to my colleagues. But after that point, when I came back, there was none of that kind of BS. And I just felt so much more present and so much more almost human. One of my guests talks about human beingness, and I felt more filled with that. And it's that quality that really inspires me, being willing to work now with other therapists or coaches who are working with people who've been impacted by trauma, and to help them to honor that and to explore that and to own that, because I do feel, and this kind of gets back to what I was alluding to before, why this is difficult for not everybody, but for a lot of people in this field, because it almost demands that you look at your own stuff, that you not only look at it, but you explore it and work through it and get it together, so much so that when you're working with someone else who's been impacted by trauma, you're not triggered, right, to the degree that you can't work sufficiently. So that's been a really big and inspiring thing for me, because I love and just value those unique elements and qualities in each of us that allow us to do this work.
We're going to step away to hear from our sponsor. We'll be right back.
This episode is sponsored by BetterHelp.com. Secure, convenient, and affordable online counseling. All counselors are licensed, accredited professionals. Anything you share is confidential. Schedule secure video or phone sessions, plus chat and text with your therapist whenever you feel it's needed. A month of online therapy often costs less than a single traditional face-to-face session. Go to BetterHelp.com/Psych Central and experience 7 days of free therapy to see if online counseling is right for you. BetterHelp.com/Psych Central.
Welcome back, everyone. We're here discussing trauma with Dr. Guy McPherson. When you've been doing these interviews, have you noticed any themes that run throughout? Anything really in common a lot?
I mean, one of them is many of the therapists, and I don't think this is going to be surprising to a lot of people, or it might, but many of the therapists have experienced trauma for themselves. And it's all types, right? I mean, it's whether they're a veteran and they've been in combat, or they've been bullied like myself, or they've had sexual trauma or emotional trauma, whatever. Oftentimes that's been there. The other theme is that there's been a lot of mistakes. And this kind of gets back to what I was just talking about. Many of those mistakes have to do with the therapist learning to be vulnerable and learning to be present and learning to not feel the need to fix or to cure or to heal, but just to be comfortable with seeing the person in front of them. Oftentimes people talk about the job of the trauma therapist is to be a witness. But for me, it's to be able to see that person. These are themes that come up, continually come up. Had someone said to me when I was just starting out learning about trauma that the main job is really to just sit there and to be present and to be who you are, to be authentic, and be able to do that and to see that person in front of you rather than have all this knowledge kind of in your brain and in your body, which again is crucial, but it's not everything. I mean, had someone said that to me, I'd have been, what do you mean? I need to learn all this stuff. That's been a real big ongoing theme.
Thank you for that.
I know that we've talked about, themes that have come up and trauma is obviously a very big theme. But aside from trauma, are there other themes that have come up other than the carrying your own stuff or having your own trauma or being triggered by your own baggage? You've interviewed over 350 people, right? I don't know if you said that or not, but I know that from your bio. That's
right.
What other patterns have emerged?
I think one of the other patterns is that the people who are doing this specific work, and by this specific work, I mean people who are working with people who've been impacted by trauma, there's a burning purpose or there's a reason why they're doing this. Whether it's someone who has been into combat and they've come back and now they're a therapist and they're working to help veterans, or they've been abused and now they're working to advocate and to help other people not experience what they've experienced. And that stuff is really, I don't know, for lack of a better word, it's intense. I mean, to talk about trauma in and of itself is hard. I mean, it's hard for me. It's ugly. But within that, for me to be, interviewing people who are so passionate about helping others who've been through hell sometimes, it's just so inspiring. And that's one of the things that really lights me up about doing this work. In part, I describe my podcast as a podcast being about the human spirit, people helping other people. Because at the core, at its most kind of fundamental, foundational level, that's what it is. And I love that people who are doing this work of helping other people who've been impacted by trauma, there's a passion kind of burning in them to do that.
Thank you. Do you think that there are certain things that most people believe about trauma or therapists that are just simply wrong? And if so, what might those things be?
First of all, for a lot of people, certainly a lot of lay people, trauma is equated with combat, with bombs going off or IEDs going off, or on another level, rape sometimes. But oftentimes, and this is one of the things that even inspired me to do this podcast, when I was doing those phone calls, when I would be talking to, say a dad or a teacher, most often it happened with parents, and it would be going through this litany of questions, and it would come out that kid or the child, whatever, had been witness to domestic violence. Oftentimes, parents and sometimes teachers didn't understand that could be traumatic. So that's number one, that there are certain things or a lot of things that can be traumatic. But another element is, what is traumatic for one person doesn't necessarily mean that's going to be traumatic for someone else. So if I use myself as an example, having been bullied, that experience, I can track it, how it just altered and shifted the trajectory in my life and how it impacted relationships and self-esteem and so forth. But for other people, you might not have experienced that way. So that's another thing that I think that's really important for people to understand, is that just because you think that something isn't traumatic doesn't mean someone else isn't going to experience that way. Another aspect to this is that people doing this work are human and they need to be human. Therapists are obliged or are obligated to do their own quote unquote inner work. And that means to work on their own traumas, whether they're small traumas or big traumas, and to constantly do that. People who are trauma therapists have to do it. I mean, there's no two ways about it. And that's one of the things that my podcast and my membership community really provides for, especially new trauma therapists to do the inner work, to understand and to value that, their individuality, their uniqueness will help them be a human being, not some clinical therapist that's just going to sit there and talk to you. And that kind of leads to another kind of myth in a sense that oftentimes people think that, I'm going to go to this therapist and they're going to make me talk about it. They're going to make me rehash it. And that's not always the case. And it shouldn't be the case, especially if you're working with, a knowledgeable and seasoned therapist. Oftentimes, talking doesn't even come into play until later on, and sometimes shouldn't. So I think those are two really good ones. Trauma, if you're a client and you've experienced trauma and you want to see a therapist, you have to find someone who's educated. You have to find someone who has had specific education in working with people who've been impacted by trauma. I mean, that's kind of a baseline. And I think it's unethical for someone to do the work who hasn't been educated. So if someone's out there, whether, if they're a client and they've experienced trauma and they're looking to get some help, find someone. There are avenues out there to help you find someone who's been properly educated and seasoned.
I really appreciate that. And I like what you said about find somebody who's educated, but find somebody who's also, focusing to get better and acknowledging that they're human. And that's really the best thing that somebody can do. I think a lot of times people look at therapists as the experts, and they are an expert on a topic, but as you pointed out, they're also human. So they have to address their own stuff so they can provide the best care possible. And I think sometimes maybe the public thinks, I don't want to say too highly of therapists, but maybe expects too much.
I agree. And, I think just inherent in the therapist-client relationship, there's a dynamic. Someone is coming to someone else to, quote unquote, get better or to find out information. And I think, again, inherent within that, there is this relationship where the therapist is kind of up here and the client is kind of down here. When I was starting out and when I was seeing clients, I was fresh out of school and I felt that, I had all this knowledge and I was the expert. And I'll tell you something else, man. I learned so much from just seeing clients and realizing that I had to take my clinical hat off. And it was something that a very seasoned professional at the last job I was talking about said. He said, if you're going to be working with this population of kids who were showing early signs of psychosis, and most of whom had experienced trauma, you've got to be willing to take off your clinical hat. And I thought to myself, what is this guy, nuts? I just got out of school. I've got this degree. But that was the big learning experience for me. And that doesn't mean forgetting what you know and forgetting your knowledge and forgetting your experience. It means showing up as a human being. Because when you're talking about people who've been impacted by trauma, oftentimes they've had everything ripped away from them that speaks to being a human being. They've had their safety taken away, their trust, the love, oftentimes, self-trust, belief in humanity, if you're talking about more interpersonal trauma or complex trauma. So to show up, as simple as it sounds, but to be able to show up as an authentic human being is vital. And again, it's not always easy because we bring all this baggage with us where we think we have to show up a certain way as a therapist and that we are the expert. Well, you're certainly not the expert of your client.
Right.
Maybe you have this certain catalog of knowledge, but you're not the expert of your client. The client is the expert. And it's the therapist's job to let them know that. They're the expert in their experience.
Well, thank you. It's always interesting to hear stories from the front lines there like that. Unfortunately, we are about out of time. So if you could just tell us where we can listen to your show and any other links or whatnot you'd like to share,
where
please
can people find you? What's your website?
Definitely. It's the traumatherapistpodcast.com. My membership community is really dedicated to new trauma therapists. Just starting out is Traumatherapist 2.0. That's traumatherapist2.com or just Traumatherapist 2.0. They can find it there. But that's it. I mean, thanks so much, guys, for having me on. It was awesome.
It was fun.
Yeah, it was excellent. Thank you so much for being here. And thank you, everyone, for tuning in. Remember, you can get a week of free, convenient, affordable, private online counseling anytime, anywhere, just by visiting betterhelp.com/PsychCentral. We will see everybody next week.
Thank you for listening to The Psych Central Show. Please rate, review, and subscribe on iTunes or wherever you found this podcast. We encourage you to share our show on social media and with friends and family. Previous episodes can be found at psychcentral.com/show. PsychCentral.com is the internet's oldest and largest independent mental health website. Psych Central is overseen by Dr. John Grohol, a mental health expert and one of the pioneering leaders in online mental health. Our host, Gabe Howard, is an award-winning writer and speaker who travels nationally. You can find more information on Gabe at gabehoward.com. Our co-host, Vincent M. Wales, is a trained suicide prevention crisis counselor and author of several award-winning speculative fiction novels. You can learn more about Vincent at vincentmwales.com. If you have feedback about the show, please email talkback@psychcentral.com.